Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, because what you're about to hear is a true story that started with something so ordinary, no one thought twice. A stray dog dragging a dirty diaper to the steps of an animal shelter. Every morning, like clockwork. At first, the staff thought it was just trash. A weird habit, maybe even a joke, but then they looked closer. One item, then another, until the pieces began to form a pattern no one could ignore. And what that dog was really doing, it wasn't scavenging, it wasn't playing, he was sending a message. Stay with us, because once you hear what this dog uncovered and what he led them to, you'll never look at a stray the same way again. At Haven Hills Animal Shelter, tucked on the outskirts of a sleepy Tennessee town, nothing surprised Sarah much anymore. She had seen too many things in her 2 decades of working with the discarded, the damaged, the voiceless. But no animal had ever gotten under her skin quite like that dog. He came at dawn, filthy, silent, a German shepherd, mixed with matted fur and eyes that saw straight through you. He never barked, never growled, never wagged, just appeared at the edge of the lot like clockwork and dropped something onto the grass before retreating slowly, never taking his eyes off the building, never letting anyone get close. At first, Sarah thought he was scrounging, looking for food like any stray, but when he left a crushed soda can on day 1, a mismatched sock on day 2, and a chicken bone on day 3, she paused. By the 4th day, when he deposited a soiled diaper still sealed and folded tight, she didn't just pause, she snapped. Again, she muttered, halfway through a sip of lukewarm coffee. I swear, if this dog brings one more thing from the trash, I'm going to lose it. The staff laughed behind her. They thought she was joking. Sarah wasn't. She'd spent years trying to keep this place running. Haven Hills wasn't fancy. They had more leaky pipes than funding. The walls were scuffed, the crates mismatched, the office printer coughed more than it worked. But they gave animals a second shot. They gave them warmth, names, and a place to heal. So why did this dog who wouldn't come close, wouldn't let them help keep showing up like some ghostly garbage collector? Amanda, the youngest on staff, was sweeping near the back gate when she spotted the dog again. You know, she called over her shoulder, maybe he thinks it's a gift. A gift? Sarah stepped outside, squinting at the figure in the distance. The dog had already dropped the diaper and was now sitting, watching, as if waiting for approval. Amanda shrugged. Maybe he's trying to be helpful. That idea clung to Sarah longer than she cared to admit. That night, after locking up, she replayed the footage from the security camera. The motion sensor wasn't great, but it was enough to catch the moment the dog emerged from the tree line. He never hesitated, walked straight to the edge of the property, placed the item down, and backed away same spot every single time. She rewatched it, twice, then slowed it down. There was a pause near the gate. A moment when the dog lowered his head toward the ground, sniffed, lingered, almost like he was checking something. Coincidence, she muttered. But the next morning, she got in early, earlier than usual. She made a point to be ready when the dog arrived. A folding chair, a flashlight, a cup of strong coffee, and a notepad balanced on her lap. If this mutt had a pattern, she was going to figure it out. At 6:08 a.m. he appeared. No barking, no drama. Just trotted out of the woods like he had an appointment, this time carrying something crumpled in his mouth. Sarah squinted. It looked like cardboard. The dog paused at the fence, set it down, and backed away. Sarah approached, slow and steady. She didn't want to spook him. Years in animal work had taught her the signs. This dog wasn't afraid, but he was cautious, measured, watching her with eyes that seemed to weigh more than their color should allow. When she knelt beside the object, an old cereal box torn down the side, she reached for it gently, using a trash grabber to lift it. The second she dropped it in the bin beside the gate, the dog stood up, not spooked, not alarmed, just done. He turned and vanished into the trees again. Same routine, Sarah murmured, but even as she said it, something inside her felt off. The watching, the timing, the precision. This wasn't just strange dog behavior. This was intentional. That evening, while Amanda organized the donation closet, Sarah pulled her aside. "Play back the footage from yesterday," she said. Before he dropped the sock, Amanda blinked. "You think it's important? Humor me." And so they did. 3 times, each video showed the same sequence. The dog entered, dropped the item. But what Sarah noticed and what chilled her was that same pause before reaching the drop point. A deliberate moment of stillness near the fence line. 3 days, 3 pauses, 3 identical positions. Amanda turned to her, brow furrowed. "You think he's what? Leaving clues?" "I don't know," Sarah said, but her voice was tighter than she meant it to be. She didn't say what was gnawing at her thoughts, that perhaps the dog wasn't bringing trash at all. Perhaps he was bringing messages. The next morning, Sarah arrived before the sky had lightened. The shelter sat in sleepy silence, the parking lot empty, the breeze light against the trees. She waited, flashlight in hand, her chair angled toward the woods. And right on time 6:11 the figure emerged. The dog, still filthy, still silent, padded across the gravel lot with something else clenched in his jaw. Small, shiny, hard to tell what it was. He paused by the gate, looked directly at her, and laid it down. Sarah stood up, heart racing. She stepped closer, carefully, hands open, low and calm. She didn't speak, didn't try to bribe him with treats, just watched. And for the first time, he stepped forward. Not much, maybe 10 feet, but it was more than he had ever dared before. She barely breathed. Then, just as quickly, he stopped, sniffed the air, tilted his head, and turned, vanishing once again. Sarah stood there for a long time, holding a folded scrap of laminated paper he had dropped. A torn coupon, smudged and dirty, but with handwriting scribbled across the back. She couldn't read all of it. Just one word stood out. "Help." She turned, slowly, to see Amanda standing at the door behind her, wide-eyed. "You saw that?" Amanda nodded. "He's not just a stray." Sarah didn't answer, because in her bones she knew. But that morning, when I saw what he brought, I knew something was deeply, terribly wrong. It wasn't just trash anymore. Sarah didn't need Amanda to say it out loud, though she did softly, one afternoon, as she held a child's worn sneaker wrapped in a strip of dirt-stained blue cloth. "This doesn't feel random," Amanda said, brushing a thumb across the frayed edge of the shoelace. "Does it?" Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. Because tucked beneath that same cloth, buried just slightly deeper in the grass where Peter had dropped it, was a cheap plastic bracelet. The kind you get from a school fair or a birthday party, the kind a little kid might never take off. It had a name etched into it, Maddie, half-faded but legible. A coincidence was no longer an option. Amanda began logging everything Peter brought. She called it the Peter Report, half serious at first, but each new item made her tone quieter, her hands slower, her eyes wider. A spoon, a pink mitten, a water-stained postcard with scribbles on the back. "He's not just bringing trash," she whispered one morning. "He's leaving breadcrumbs." Sarah watched the footage again. This time, it wasn't just the drop-offs. It was the pauses, the stillness before each approach. Like Peter was scanning, sensing, waiting to see if someone was paying attention. The following Monday, Sarah picked up the phone and called Frank Garrett, the county sheriff, and an old high school classmate who'd helped her pull a raccoon out of a storm drain 2 summers ago. When he arrived at the shelter, coffee in one hand, badge on his hip, she led him straight to the break room and hit play on the security footage. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there with his arms folded, watching the dog walk out of the woods, drop a child's shoe, then sit like a statue. "You're saying," Frank finally said, rubbing the bridge of his nose, "this stray is leaving you evidence?" "I'm not saying anything," Sarah replied. "I'm showing you what's been happening." He squinted at the screen. Could just be stuff he dug up somewhere. Dogs bring home weird things all the time. Amanda stepped in. 3 of the items had the same name on them, Maddie. One was a spoon with her initials. This, she held up a laminated scrap, looks like part of a missing persons flyer. Frank took the paper from her. It was smeared, torn down the middle, but the layout was familiar, an image once stapled to bulletin boards and pinned to gas station windows. On the back, written faintly in pencil, a partial sentence still clung to the fibers. "Please find me." Sarah met Frank's eyes. "You still think it's just coincidence?" He exhaled slowly. "I'll check the missing persons database." "But you understand how this sounds, right?" Sarah didn't care how it sounded anymore. She just knew it felt like Peter was trying to tell them something. And if no one else was going to listen, she would. That night, long after the shelter closed and the staff had gone home, Sarah sat in the front office with a single desk lamp on and the bracelet still in her hand. It was small, so small, the kind of thing a child would fiddle with during car rides, while waiting in grocery store lines, while watching cartoons. She held it gently, afraid it might crumble from too much time in the ground. She thought about all the things Peter had brought, and how he'd never once taken food from them, never let anyone touch him. Like his mission wasn't about survival, it was about delivery, a message, a memory, a map. Amanda had started pinning photos of the objects on the wall behind Sarah's desk. Beside each item, she noted the date, time, and weather. She wasn't sure why the weather mattered, she just said it might help. Sarah didn't argue, because the thing that chilled her most wasn't the items themselves. It was the consistency, the intention. Each morning, Peter came. Each morning, he brought something else. Until Thursday. Thursday, Peter brought nothing. He didn't come bearing trash or ribbon or even a bottle cap. He came with nothing in his mouth, his paws muddy, his coat damp from early fog. He walked to the same patch of grass, stopped and just stared at the building. Sarah opened the door, stepped out into the chill, and waited. Peter didn't move. Then, for the first time since he'd ever arrived at Haven Hills, he opened his mouth and barked. One single sharp bark, loud, deep, jarring in its clarity. Amanda, who'd been refilling the water bowls near the kennels, froze. Did he just? Sarah raised a hand to stop her. Peter hadn't moved. He was still staring at them. One bark, no more. Then he turned, not vanishing into the woods like he usually did, but walking deliberately along the side of the fence, toward the spot he always paused at in the videos. Sarah followed, keeping her steps light, measured. When she reached the fence line, Peter had already disappeared into the shadows beyond the tree line, but she looked down and saw it. Barely covered by leaves, almost hidden beneath a layer of pine needles and dust, was a torn, crumpled piece of paper. She knelt down and brushed it away with the corner of her sleeve. Underneath it was a small, pink sneaker, mud-caked, water-damaged, and unmistakably child-sized. She picked it up and turned it over. Inside, written in black marker, were the initials M.R. Her breath caught. Amanda appeared beside her, hands over her mouth. "Peter's not leaving us trash," she whispered. "He's leaving us Maddie." Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. Because in that moment, something inside her shifted. What had started as a strange routine, a mystery they could laugh about, had turned into something unshakably real. The dog hadn't just been circling, he'd been searching, guiding, leaving evidence. And no one had been listening. Until now, Sarah reached for her radio. Her hands were shaking. "Frank," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "we might have a case." Because Peter hadn't brought a thing that day, he had brought a warning. And then, on Thursday morning, Peter didn't bring anything. He just stood there and barked one single bark, echoing like an alarm across the lot. The bark wasn't just a sound, it was a summons. Sarah felt it in her chest, like something ancient had been shaken awake. When Peter vanished into the woods that morning, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her flashlight, an old canvas backpack, a walkie, and a thermos of coffee she never got to drink. She didn't tell Amanda where she was going. Amanda already knew. They all did. Peter wasn't wandering. He was waiting for someone to follow. The forest behind Haven Hills was deceptively quiet. It looked gentle from the edge of the lot, but within minutes of crossing the fence, the air shifted. Thicker, still, Every leaf crunch and broken twig sounded louder than it should have. Sarah kept her steps steady, her breathing slow, her eyes fixed on the figure ahead. Peter didn't look back. He didn't need to. They walked through dewy grass and patches of fog, past leaning pines and brittle ferns, down a gentle slope that deepened into a dry ravine. The ground turned soft and uneven. Sarah nearly twisted her ankle twice. She didn't care. After almost an hour of silent tracking, Peter slowed. He veered right into a narrow break in the underbrush and emerged into a clearing no bigger than a small bedroom. The earth was darker here, disturbed. Something had clearly lived in this space recently. There was a torn blanket draped over a patch of flattened ground, a cracked pink plastic cup lying sideways, and beside it, a stuffed rabbit missing an eye. Not a camp, not quite a den. It was something between the two. Sarah crouched, brushing away debris with her gloved hand. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and something older, like time, had settled thickly here. She didn't have to say anything. Amanda, who had quietly caught up behind her, knelt beside the blanket. "Someone stayed here," she whispered. "Someone small." Sarah's hand landed on something sharp poking through the dirt. She pulled out a clump of fur brown, soft but soaked and stiff with age. Nearby, hidden beneath a rotting log, were bones. Not human. Deer, most likely. Still, it was clear this place had provided shelter. Enough for a few nights, maybe more. Peter didn't move. He stood by the edge of the clearing, watching them work, his tail still, his ears alert. Sarah glanced over and met his eyes. He held her gaze without blinking. Then, quietly, she took the leash from her pack and approached. For the first time, Peter didn't step away. She clipped it on with careful fingers. No tension, no resistance. He had chosen this moment. He was ready. Back at the shelter, Amanda radioed Frank with the coordinates. Frank called in the search and rescue team. Within hours, officers and volunteers began arriving with dogs, gear, and maps. But Sarah already knew what they'd find, or rather, what they wouldn't. They weren't going to find Maddie here. This place wasn't where it ended. It was where something had started. That evening, after the first round of searchers left, Frank returned with a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a torn piece of pink paper, smeared with damp dirt and colored pencil marks. It had been wedged beneath a fallen branch near the edge of the clearing. On it, in unsteady handwriting, were the words, "Mommy, I'm trying to get back." The note wasn't signed. It didn't have to be. Sarah sat on the steps of the shelter that night, staring out into the dark trees with Peter beside her. He wouldn't go inside, wouldn't lie down. He just sat there watchful, composed, waiting. The next day, a team of officers combed the perimeter. Drones scanned from above. Dogs sniffed through every scrap of scent, but the trail was broken. It was Peter who led them forward again. He didn't run. He didn't pull. He simply walked, steady and sure, like he knew exactly where to go next. Sarah and Amanda followed closely. The terrain grew harder, the slope sharper. Thicker brambles clawed at their jackets and snagged at their sleeves. They crossed a shallow stream, its rocks slick with moss, and climbed a ridge where Peter stopped. He turned in a slow circle, nose to the wind, then led them down the other side into a narrow trench. There, half buried beneath a curl of ivy and roots, was a tin lunchbox with cartoon characters barely visible on its faded lid. Amanda knelt, brushed away the moss, and opened it. Inside, a handful of pebbles, a folded leaf, a broken crayon, and a locket with a child's photo curled inside. Maddie, curly blonde hair, bright, uneven smile. It wasn't just a cache. It was a child's world condensed into a box. Frank arrived within the hour. When he saw the contents, his face went still. He handed the photo to one of his deputies and called the mother. Melissa arrived the next morning. She said nothing when she saw the lunchbox, just dropped to her knees beside it and pulled it to her chest. Peter stood behind her, tail low, not moving. And when Melissa whispered, "That's her," it was Peter who leaned forward, gently, and placed his head against her shoulder. Sarah stepped back, letting the moment settle. She didn't need words. The clearing had given them truth. But what it hadn't given, what none of them had yet, was Maddie. because someone else had been here too. Not just the girl, not just the dog, someone else. And it was only now that they realized. There had been a man in these woods before them. They found her just past dawn. Peter led them along a trail no search party had taken through a patch of alder trees, then down a slope where the soil grew soft and the air turned colder. The wind moved differently there, quiet, unsettled, like it didn't know whether to warn or welcome them. Sarah walked just behind Peter, Amanda on her heels. They weren't speaking. Words would have only disturbed the silence pressing around them. Then they saw her, a small figure huddled beneath the overhang of a crumbling hillside. She wasn't hidden, not really. She was simply still, wrapped in a sheet of thermal foil like the ones rescue teams use. Her blonde hair was tangled, matted with leaves and dirt. Her face was pale, too pale, but her eyes were open, and when they landed on Peter, she didn't flinch. She whispered one word, "Friend." Peter didn't move forward. He waited until Melissa arrived. The second her mother saw the child, saw the unmistakable curls, the thin frame, the pink ribbon still tied clumsily to one wrist, she fell to her knees in the dirt, hands trembling. She didn't cry right away. She couldn't. She just held out her arms and let Maddie collapse into her. It should have been the end, but what Maddie said next changed everything. She didn't speak much at first, just short, broken phrases in a voice like cracked porcelain. Sarah sat beside her while the paramedics checked her pulse and gave her sips of water. Peter stayed inches from her side, not wagging his tail, not making a sound, just watching, as if he was still on guard. Later, back at the shelter, Melissa sat beside Maddie's cot while the girl began to talk. It wasn't a fall, it wasn't a moment of wandering too far from the trail. There had been a man. He had a beard, Maddie said. Big hands. A heavy coat that smelled like wet dirt and metal. He told her Mommy didn't want her anymore, that she'd been forgotten, that the woods were her new home. He gave her candy, then silence. He didn't always talk. Sometimes he just stared, sometimes he disappeared for days, but Maddie never moved from the spot where Peter first found her. Because Peter was the one who stayed, he brought her berries, bits of rabbit meat, once even a sandwich wrapped in foil. She didn't know where he found it, she just knew she was hungry, and he was there. He would curl around her at night to keep her warm. He barked when the man came back. The second time the man tried to approach, Peter lunged. He bit his arm. Maddie heard the man scream and run. After that, the man didn't come back again. Peter stayed. Frank came to the shelter that evening, a case file in hand. When Maddie described the tattoo as snake, "Here," she said, pointing to her wrist, he grew still. They had a name. A man who had been arrested 7 years earlier for attempting to lure a child from a supermarket. The charges didn't stick, no conviction. But his last known address was less than 30 miles from the trail Maddie disappeared on. His name had surfaced in 2 other investigations, both involving remote areas, both involving missing children, both with no closure. Frank ran the prints again. The crime scene where the lunchbox was found had yielded a broken soda can with partial DNA. It wasn't enough for a full match, but it was enough to reopen the case. Maddie had drawn a picture that afternoon, a simple image, crayon lines on printer paper. It showed a girl, a dog, and a man. The man had no face, but his arms were long, and he towered over the girl. Above her, a star. In her hand, she held the paw of the dog. "That's Peter," she said. Then she pointed to the man. "He said we couldn't go home." Sarah folded the drawing and placed it gently in a plastic sleeve. Amanda labeled it and added it to the growing case file. For everyone else, this was resolution. For Peter, it was just another morning. At 6:09 a.m. the following day, he stood by the tree line again. No leash, no signal, just waiting. Sarah opened the door to the shelter, stepped out and looked at him. He turned, walked 10 feet, then stopped. He wasn't finished, and that was the moment Sarah realized they had found Maddie. But Peter was still searching. We thought it was over, but Peter, he kept returning to the edge of the woods every morning. Peter returned to the woods the next day, and the next, and the next. At first, they thought it was habit. trauma playing itself out, but he didn't go back to where they found Maddie. He took new turns, followed unseen trails, and every time someone followed him, he led them somewhere different. The first was a shallow cave tucked beneath a ridge, barely large enough for a person to crouch. Inside, they found a small, moldy sock wedged under a rock and a child's comb with 2 missing teeth. Amanda picked it up gently, reading the scratched-in initials at the base. Someone's daughter, someone's past. Then came the hollow tree, deep in a gully that hadn't seen footsteps in years. Buried beneath the bark, Peter pawed until they found it. A faded photograph, creased and torn, showing 2 children smiling on a swing set, a date from 2003 scrawled in marker on the back. And then the cabin. They reached it on a cold morning, frost still clinging to the underbrush. It was nothing more than a shell roof, partially caved in, vines tangled through the window frames. But inside, beneath a loose floorboard Peter scratched at until his pads bled, they uncovered a tiny, rusted bracelet. Wooden beads, painted letters, some still visible. Carrie. Frank stood in the doorway, the morning sun slicing across his face. She disappeared from the county fair in '06, he said quietly. They thought she'd run off. Nobody ever looked this far out. Sarah didn't speak. Neither did Amanda. They just watched Peter, who now sat beside the floorboard, eyes focused, not on them, but on something else, something only he could feel. Back at the shelter, Amanda began building what she called the Room of Names. It wasn't an official investigation space, just a quiet room in the back, where the walls filled with photographs, ribbons, crayon drawings, and names written in block letters. Families began showing up, some local, some from hours away. A few just wanted to look. Others brought old keepsakes hoping for a match. Peter never went into the room. He would sit outside the door, tail curled, unmoving, as if he knew the weight inside belonged to others. He only opened doors. It wasn't his job to close them. One day, Melissa returned. She had been quieter since Maddie came home. Stronger in some ways, but there was something unfinished in her eyes. That morning, as Peter waited by the fence, Melissa approached Sarah in the shelter kitchen. "There's someone else," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "My cousin, Ellie." She vanished in '95. No one ever found anything. I didn't want to ask before, but can I show him her picture? Sarah nodded. Melissa knelt beside Peter and held out the photograph. A girl, maybe 12, smiling in a Halloween costume, one arm wrapped around a younger sibling. Peter sniffed it once. Then the next morning, he walked in a direction he hadn't taken before. They crossed a frozen creek and climbed a moss-slick hill. No paths, no markers, just wilderness. Peter moved slower this time, pausing more often. It was Amanda who spotted the clearing, a ring of birch trees surrounding a collapsed log. Peter scratched once, then stepped back. Beneath the soil, beneath roots that had grown thick with time, they uncovered a metal hair clip, still shaped like a butterfly. Nearby, a small coin purse, barely holding together, with faded embroidery stitched along the hem. Melissa pressed her hand to her mouth when she saw it. She used to call it her treasure, she whispered. She hid pennies in it. Frank sent in a forensic team. The site was secured, the evidence logged. Ellie's name was added to the Room of Names. A single pressed flower taped next to it, the kind she used to collect. Melissa stood in front of the wall for a long time that night. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But when she walked out of the room, her shoulders were straighter, lighter, like some part of her had been given back. And Peter kept going. Every few days, he'd lead them out again. A plastic ring, a strip of fabric, a music toy that let out one final note before its battery died. He was never rushed, never frantic, but he was tireless. Sarah started wondering how long he'd been doing this. Before he came to Haven Hills, before he carried a diaper to their doorstep, had there been other shelters? Other towns that didn't pay attention? Amanda said one night as they sat outside with him under a quiet sky, "I think he's always been doing this. We're just the first ones who listened." But there was a shift, a change none of them could name, but all could feel. Peter was slowing down, not dramatically, not at first, just a little more hesitation before rising, a deeper breath after each dig. His coat was thinner, his eyes sometimes distant. But when Maddie walked through the door, he still stood, even if his legs trembled beneath him. Then came the morning when he didn't stand at all. And one morning, Peter didn't get up. Peter didn't rise with the sun that morning. He lay curled beneath the kitchen table, unmoving except for the soft rise and fall of his ribs. Melissa had left a folded blanket there the night before, and Maddie had tucked her drawing of him, a simple sketch of a dog, under a tree beside his paw. But he hadn't touched his food. He hadn't made a sound. Sarah crouched beside him, gently placing her hand on his side. His breathing was slow but steady. His eyes blinked open once, then closed again. There was no panic, no struggle, just a quiet surrender, like a sentinel who had kept watch too long and knew his post was nearly finished. The vet came quickly. Dr. Crosby, who had tended to the animals at Haven Hills for years, moved with a reverence none of them had seen before. After a long, silent exam, she spoke softly. He's not in pain, but his body's telling him it's time. His muscles are spent, his heart's strong, but the rest, it's just done. Nobody said anything. Amanda leaned against the wall, arms folded, trying to keep her tears from falling. Melissa sat beside Maddie on the floor, holding her close. And Peter, ever calm, simply rested. They moved him gently to the living room, laying him on the softest blanket they could find. Sarah lit the fireplace, letting its warmth fill the room. Around Peter, they placed the small things he had brought over the past year: Maddie's spoon, the faded bracelet, the crumpled flyer, even the soda can that started it all. They didn't speak of what he had done. They didn't need to. It was all there, laid out like a timeline of truth. But as night fell and silence deepened, Peter stirred. He lifted his head slowly, looked around the room. Then, with a quiet determination that none of them could comprehend, he barked once. Not weak, not strained, a single, deep bark. Sarah stood. Amanda grabbed her coat. Melissa hesitated. "You're not," she started, but Peter had already begun to move. His legs wobbled, but he stood. He took a step, then another. His body, frail but unyielding, carried him to the door. He turned once, glancing at Maddie, who was already rising to follow. She didn't ask. She just looked at her mom and said, "He needs to finish." They drove to the edge of the forest, parking near the trailhead they'd walked so many times before. Peter stepped out of the vehicle and walked without pause. No leash, no coaxing, just purpose. Through the woods, he led them farther than they had ever followed, up a steep incline where frost clung to branches like lace, over a shallow creek, the water whispering secrets beneath the ice, until finally he stopped at a circle of trees, a grove untouched by sunlight. He scratched once at the ground, then sat. They dug. Beneath the snow-damp earth, wrapped in a faded scarf, was a small wooden box. Inside, a locket, a yellowed letter, and a child's drawing on paper so brittle it nearly tore in Sarah's hands. The letter was dated 1993. It told the story of a woman on the run, escaping someone who had hurt her, pregnant, alone. She had left the woods to deliver the baby, she wrote, but had returned to hide again. There was no trace of what happened next. Frank met them at the shelter an hour later. "We traced the name," he said, "Margaret Daniels. She was never reported missing, but there's a birth certificate. She had a son in '97, no known father. The boy was adopted. They found him. 27 years old now. He drove 6 hours to reach Haven Hills." Sarah handed him the letter, the box. He sat down on the floor of the room of names and wept, not for what was lost, but for what was finally known. Peter lay nearby, his head resting on the locket as if protecting it one last time. Maddie curled up beside him, silent. "You found her too," she whispered. That night, Peter didn't wake. He passed with his nose pressed to the box, surrounded by the stories he'd carried on his back and in his bones. No fanfare, no drama, just peace. The next morning, Sarah opened the front gate and found flowers lined up along the fence. Dozens of them, people from town, strangers who had read Maddie's story, former foster kids, parents of the lost. They came with candles, with handwritten notes, with tokens of thanks no one had asked for. Maddie planted an oak tree behind the shelter. At its base, a plaque, he remembered them. In the weeks that followed, the foundation was born. Maddie called it Peter's Path. It wasn't just for finding the missing, it was for teaching others how to see. To recognize the signs, the worn shoe on the trail, the spoon in the mud, the torn charm beneath the leaves, and know they meant something. To believe in the details, in the forgotten, in the quiet clues that most people overlooked. Volunteers joined from other towns, then other states. Amanda trained teams on tracking. Melissa led outreach for grieving families. Frank coordinated with investigators, opening old cases long shelved. And Sarah, who had once scoffed at a dog dragging a diaper across her lawn, became the voice of something much bigger. They never filled Peter's old corner in the shelter. His blanket stayed there, undisturbed, beneath a painting someone mailed of him beneath a glowing moon. And every year on the day Peter found Maddie, they returned to the fence where it began. They laid flowers, they left ribbons, and they listened. Because what Peter taught them wasn't about heroics, it was about attention. About believing that even the smallest thing could be a cry for help. About knowing that some voices don't come in words. And most of all, about listening, especially when no one else does. Peter didn't just save Maddie, he lit a torch that still burns. And every step he took reminded the world that some stories deserve to be remembered, even if they start with something as small as trash on a front lawn. So maybe now, when you see a dog staring at something you can't see, or pausing by a fence with something strange in its mouth, you'll stop and wonder not what it's carrying, but why. Peter reminded us that sometimes the loudest cries for help come without a sound, and the most faithful messengers walk on four legs with nothing but instinct and heart. He was never just a stray. He was a guide, a memory keeper, a bridge between the lost and the ones still searching. What would you have done if Peter showed up at your door? Let us know in the comments below, and if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There are more stories waiting to be heard, more paths still to follow. And sometimes all it takes is one quiet bark,